Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to show you how to start a vegetable plot. So the first thing you need to do is find a good site for one. So you need to have somewhere that's nice and sunny, ideally quite sheltered as well, somewhere that's nice and warm and really bakes in the sun. Vegetables like a lot of sunshine, so you want to find a nice sunny position. If you are planting lettuce or something like that, and it's going to be very hot in your part of the world, you might want a little bit of shade from the midday sun, but generally you want a nice sunny location. So once you found a good spot, you then want to start clearing the site, making it ready. Now if you're doing it on a previous lawn, then you'll need to look up another video and figure out how to remove turf. It's quite involved and you need to cut the turf off. If it's a previous site which had vegetables on it before, or if it's just a weedy area, then I'll show you how to prepare that, and that's what we've got here. This is a vegetable plot from a year ago, and you can see it's covered in small annual weeds. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and clear the site. But first of all, I'll tell you the tools and equipment that you'll need. So first of all, you want a garden fork. This is so you can dig over the soil, and it just makes it a lot easier for mixing the soil than using a spade. You can also use a spade, that's an option. It depends on your soil. If you've got really heavy, hard to dig soil, a spade can sometimes be easier than a fork. But I tend to use a fork because that way you can really mix the soil a bit more easily than you can with a spade. Spade takes out the soil in big chunks, the fork tends to break it up nicely. So the next thing you'll need is a container to collect all the weeds so you can remove them and take them to a different location. A trowel can also be useful as well for some of the smaller weeds, or if you haven't got the strength to be using a full-size fork or spade, a trowel can be a lot easier if you don't have the strength for that. Not essential but very useful is a rake. This will allow you to get a nice even surface to the soil, and also so you can rake out any larger lumps in the soil, make it easier for the seeds to germinate. And so you can do it without this, but it's just a bit trickier, and a rake will just make your life a lot easier. You will also want some good quality compost. Now the compost doesn't have to be really rich, it is just a soil improver. So you can go for well-rotted horse manure, you can go for garden compost from your own garden, or you can buy multi-purpose compost. Any of that will work well with starting your vegetable plot. And finally, you will also want some slow-release fertilizer. Now if you're using manure, you can skip this part and you can just use the manure as the fertilizer and the compost in one. Or what I tend to do, because I don't have a good source of manure, is I use a mixture of compost and slow-release fertilizer. So the first thing I need to do to prepare the site is to remove the weeds, make sure there's no competition for the new plants. So for removing the weeds, what you will need is a fork, or you can use a trowel, as I say, if a fork is a bit heavy for you. So for example, this area is a complete mess of weeds. I'm just going to start in any location. What I'm going to do is put the fork in, not all the way, and then just kind of loosen it up like this, and go around and loosen this whole area. This is fine for small weeds. What I will then find is as I am pulling this up, I can then pull on the roots, shake off the soil, and they should come out really easily. And I can clear this whole site quickly doing that. Now I'll also show you how to do this for bigger weeds. So if you have bigger weeds like this one here, what you want to do is you want to go away with the fork around about half a fork's length away, and then you want to go in quite deep with the fork, right down so the fingers of the fork are completely buried, and then you want to tease back. What you'll notice is the whole weed will then start to shift upwards. Then you can just gently pull it out. You'll have loosened the root and that'll come out nice and easy. So that's how you do the bigger weeds. Now it depends how big the weed is. You might have to go down as deep as you can with the fork, wiggle it from one side, go around another side, wiggle it again, and just go around all directions of the root system until you can loosen it enough to get it out. And it's very important that you get every little piece of root out, because many of the perennial weeds can regrow from a tiny bit of root, so make sure you don't leave any roots behind, otherwise it will just come back with weeds within a few weeks. So now that you've cleared your site of weeds, it's time to dig it over. Now you can actually skip the weeding stage and the digging over stage if you want to do a no-dig garden. So I will put a video up soon in the next few weeks of how to do a no-dig vegetable garden as well. I personally prefer that method. It's a lot easier, but it does take a lot longer to get things going. You can't get an instant result. You do have to wait a few weeks for it to work. But anyway, I'll go ahead now with the digging method. So this is the site now cleared. Now if you do have some very heavy soil, before you put the compost and the fertilizer on, you might want to dig it over first. I know I've got quite loose sandy soil, so digging over won't be difficult and it'll be easy to incorporate the compost and the feed. So I'm going to go ahead now and put a scattering of feed on the surface. So as I said before, you can use manure, or you can use chicken manure pellets. You can use chemical fertilizers as well. You can use something called Grow More. That's quite an instant feed mix, so if you do use that, don't use it with seedlings because it can be a bit strong. So what I tend to like using is bloodfish and bone. It's an organic feed and it lasts for a long time, so it slowly breaks down in the compost. So when you start your seedlings, they don't get burnt by the excess fertilizer, and it will last for several months as well. So if you put a lot in at the beginning, it should last for most of the growing season, apart from when used with really heavy feeding vegetables or ones with a very long growing season. So before you put the fertilizer and the compost on, what you want to do is you want to level the site. The reason for this is if you put it on an uneven site, you'll have some areas which have a lot more feed and some areas with a lot less. Same with the compost. So make sure your site is nice and even first of all. Now if you only have a spade, you can do this with a spade. It's just a bit more time consuming and a bit more difficult. You can just level it like that. But ideally you would have a rake. So this stage doesn't have to be perfectly level. You just want to get a rough level so that you don't have any deep bits or high up bits. And whilst you're doing this, you'll notice a lot of weeds that you thought you'd taken out suddenly reappear. The reason for that is when you're weeding, you take out the plants, you bury some of the other weeds with the soil that falls off their roots. So you'll notice here a lot of weeds have appeared. So as I'm raking this, I want to also go through and remove any of the weeds. So now that the site is mostly level and the weeds are removed, it's time to add the compost and the feed. Now whilst you're doing this whole process, try and stand on the soil as little as possible. If you have to stand on it, make sure you have some boards or something on top. If you stand on it and it's before the digging stage, it's not a big issue, but if you do it after the digging stage, what happens is just, as it stands in the soil, it compacts it down, and that's going to make it more difficult for the roots to grow through the soil. It's also going to make it more difficult for the water to permeate through it. So try and not compact it as best you can. Now obviously in a large site this is not really doable, but just try and keep it to a minimum as much as possible. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to scatter some slow release bloodfish and bone over the surface as a fertilizer. So it depends on your fertilizer how thick you need to do it, and it also depends on the type of plants you're growing. But what I like to do is just do a thin scattering so I can see every surface is covered, and every little bit of the soil, once it's dug in, it's going to make sure that this crop has a nice feed. And this will do for fairly hungry plants. If you want to grow tomatoes or pumpkins, if they're really hungry, you might want to add a little bit more than that. So now that you've got a thin covering of your feed on the surface, now you want to add in your compost. So the feed that I put on will give the plants the nutrients that they need to grow well. The compost adds a little bit of nutrients, but the main thing with the compost is it adds organic matter, which is absolutely ideal for the soil. Now I could go into a whole video about all the benefits of compost, but I'll just keep it brief for this one. So with the compost, what that really helps with is water retention. So it acts like a sponge. It means you don't have to water as often. Your plants will thrive much better in drought. It also stops the soil from compacting as easily. So even if you do walk on the soil, it's not such a big issue. It also has lots of micronutrients that your feeds might not have, and it has lots of organic matter which gets broken down by soil microbes like worms and other little bacteria and fungi. And as they work through the soil, they can work with the plants and give your plants some extra nutrition. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get the rake and just make sure I've got a nice even covering of compost. You'll see there's a few lumps as well. This is quite common. This is really common, especially if you bought it as bags of compost. So you want to make sure these are broken up and they can be easily mixed in with the soil. So as well as raking this out and getting a nice even surface, the rake can also be really useful for breaking up any of the solid lumps at this stage and also at the digging stage. So I'll just rake this out so we've got a nice even covering now. Every section should have a similar level of compost so that when it's dug in, there isn't anywhere that has not much compost and other places that have too much. So you can see here, I'll just break it up with the rake, make sure there's no hard lumps. And when it comes to compost amounts, the more the better generally. As long as you don't get more than 50% compost mixed with soil, you just want to get as much organic matter in as you can. The more compost, the more benefits it's going to do for your soil. When it comes to feed, make sure you go with the recommended amounts depending on your type of feed, because if you have too much, it will burn the roots and you can actually kill your plants. But with compost, and generally, the more the better. So now we've got a nice covering. The next thing we need to do is dig it in. So what you want to do with your fork is go down as deep as you can, which is normally the full length of the fingers on the fork. You want to go in, you want to pull back, and you can see here, you then just want to flip it over. And you want to do this with all the soil. Now, if you've got heavy clay, this might be a bit difficult, and you might need to use a spade, and it might come out in whole with big lumps. Now, because this has originally been a garden vegetable plot, and the soil here is quite loose and sandy, you can see it's breaking apart nicely. There's no hard lumps. But if there was any hard lumps, what I need to do is just break it apart like this with the fork, and make sure they're all taken away. And if you're doing it over a larger site, and you don't want to walk where you've dug, the best way to do it is just to work backwards. So you're walking on some of the plot, but that doesn't matter because you're going to loosen that up as you're walking backwards, just breaking things up. And if you do accidentally bury a small weed and it's deep down, don't worry too much. If it's quite deep and it's a small weed, it will probably just die off. So I'm just going to go along now and do this on the whole plot. So that's the whole plot now dug over. What this does is it digs the compost into a good depth. Now you can do something called double digging. You might want to do that if it's with potatoes or root crops. I'm not going to show it in this video because it's a bit more advanced. It's not really a basic style of digging, but basically if you dig down 1 foot in depth, that should be fine for the majority of plants. If you are doing root vegetables, make sure when you're going through the soil that you take out any stones. If a carrot or a parsnip hits the stone, the root will get misshapen and you might get 10 or 20 little mini roots, which aren't really edible, instead of the one big root. So make sure any stones are taken out as you're progressing. So next I'm just going to give it another rake, make sure it's nice and level. The reason why I rake it again is I've loosened up the soil. Some bits will have puffed up more than others depending how compacted it was to begin with. So you want to give it a very quick rake just to make sure that any bits that were really compacted and have been loosened a lot haven't jumped up too much. Now that we've flipped over the soil and we've got a lot of the compost and feed incorporated, it still needs a little bit more mixing to get it really mixed in well. So on a soil like mine that is so loose, this might not be necessary, but I like to do it anyway. And that's just, you get the fork and you just twist it like this and you just go around. You don't have to go a foot deep because it's normally a bit too difficult to turn the fork at that depth. You can see some of the weeds are popping up. This will happen every now and again, just move them. You want to just do this, and this just mixes that in really nicely. The initial dig that you did, what that will do is it will get it down to a good depth and it will mix it in a bit, but this will really mix it in nicely. So just go through the whole bed, twisting as you go, working backwards as well. So if you compact anywhere, you then loosen it up, and that will be the bed nearly done and almost ready for planting. So that's the bed nearly prepared. What you should be looking for is a really nice loose soil that you can just push your hand in. You can see that hand goes in easy and it's nice and loose and it just kind of crumbles in your hand. You don't want it to be dust. If it's like dust, you need some more water or you need a lot more compost. You want this kind of nice loose soil that just kind of crumbles away, and so the roots can grow through this really easily. So I'm just going to rake this over, making sure there's no big lumps, there's not any stones and there's not any weeds, and that the soil is generally nice and level. And this is making a nice bed now for growing the plants. That's it raked over. The last thing you might want to do, because when this settles over time it will be uneven and it can be a bit too loose for the plant roots, is very gently with the fork. You just want to go over it like this and just give it a very slight firming down, just to make sure that the soil isn't too loose. Now you don't want to do this very hard or really ram it in because that will compact it too much. This is just to do a little bit of compacting to help it, because it will settle naturally, but if you don't do this it will take a few days to settle. And if you plant in straight away, what can happen is things can move and shift slightly. So once it's just tamped down ever so gently, just give it a very light tickle with the rake, just to make sure everything's nice and level. And then you've got a beautifully prepared vegetable plot ready for planting. So you can see there a little stone. I just pull that out, fill in the hole with the excess soil. So that's all it takes to start a vegetable plot. I'm not going to go into the details of planting in this stage. This is just getting the site prepared. But I have made a whole series of videos about gardening vegetables if you want to look at my YouTube channel. And if you're interested in the no-dig method, which I personally prefer because it's a lot easier and it's actually a lot better for your soil, I'll be making a video in a few weeks about that as well.